Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I invite you to take a journey into one of the most terrifying and mysterious crime cases in modern America. If you're new here, please be sure to subscribe and turn on your bell as we bring you new cases every week to get you going. Today we're going to take a look at a case that has chilled all of Long Island for 13 years and has been dubbed by the media as the Gilgo Beach Killer or the Long Island Serial Killer. It's a story full of mystery, tragedy, and also hope for justice that came more than a decade later. It all began in May of the year 2010, when 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert mysteriously disappeared from the gated community of Oak Beach on Long Island. That night, she called 911, screaming in a desperate voice that someone was trying to kill her. Then, it was as if the earth had descended upon her. The police started looking. They searched the deserted beaches along Ocean Parkway, the sand dunes, and thick brush. No one knew at the time that this search for one missing woman would reveal something far, far more horrific. In December of that year, during a routine search of the area with a police dog, investigators found human remains, but it wasn't the end. 2 days later, they discovered 3 more bodies, all wrapped in burlap, all deposited along the same deserted road leading to the beach. And that was just the beginning. This discovery triggered one of the largest serial killer investigations in the history of the United States. Today, I'm going to tell you the whole story from beginning to end, so sit back, because this is gonna be a ride. When police officer John Malia set out on December 11, 2010, with his specially trained dog Blue on a routine search mission along Ocean Parkway, he never expected that day to change Long Island crime scene history forever. Blue, a German shepherd trained to search for human remains, suddenly became intensely responsive in an area just 400 yards from Gilgo Beach. What Officer Malia found in the thick brush and tall grass was something that would cause him countless sleepless nights. Wrapped in burlap, partially hidden by vegetation, lay human remains. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, indicating that it had been lying there for months, perhaps even years. The site was immediately secured, and investigators began meticulously documenting every detail. The bag was the standard kind of burlap you can buy at any home improvement store. The perp was careful, methodical. This was not a passionate murder or a random act. It was premeditated, cold-blooded, and horrifically organized. But what followed over the next 24 to 48 hours shocked even the most seasoned investigators. When police units expanded their search perimeter and began systematically searching the entire area along the highway, they discovered another body on December 13th. The same sackcloth, the same modus operandi, a distance of approximately 150 meters from the first discovery, and then another, and another. By the end of the weekend, investigators had 4 bodies, all female, all bagged in identical fashion, all located at regular intervals along this deserted stretch of Ocean Parkway. These 4 bodies became known as the Gilgo 4, the first confirmed victims of what the media began calling the Gilgo Beach Killer. And now I'm going to tell you about each of these women because they deserve to have their stories told. Melissa Barthelemy. First found. Melissa was the first person to be found. She was 24 years old when she disappeared from the Bronx in July of the year 2009. She was from Buffalo, New York, and she had big dreams. She was a young woman with an infectious laugh who loved her family, especially her younger sister Amanda. Melissa had a tattoo of a butterfly and stars that made her easily identifiable. She worked as an escort and advertised her services through Craigslist, which was common among women in the profession at the time. Melissa wasn't naive. She knew the risks, but she did what she had to do to survive in a tough city like New York. The last her family knew of her was that she was going to meet a client somewhere on Long Island. Then the ground fell away from her. What made Melissa's case particularly horrific was what happened after she disappeared. Someone started calling her younger sister Amanda, 15, from Melissa's cell phone. The calls came the summer after her disappearance and were cruel, taunting. The caller was using Melissa's phone to mentally torture her family. This suggested that the perpetrator was not just a murderer. He was a sadist who enjoyed the suffering he inflicted not only on his victims, but on their loved ones as well. When the forensic team identified the first body as Melissa, her family finally got the answers they had been waiting 17 months for, but those answers only brought more pain. Maureen Brainard Barnes, mother with a big heart. The second body belonged to 25-year-old Maureen Brainard Barnes of Norwich, Connecticut. Maureen disappeared 2 years before Melissa in July of the year 2007. She was a single mother desperate for ways to support her family. Maureen was known for her love of music and her bright smile that could light up a room. Like Melissa, Maureen worked as an escort and advertised on Craigslist. On July 9, 2007, she left her hotel in New York to meet a client. She told her friend that she should be back in an hour. She never came back. Her cell phone stopped transmitting a signal later that day in the Massapequa and Lindenhurst area of Long Island. Investigators later determined that 16 contacts were made between Maureen's phone and a phone later identified as the perpetrator's wiretap phone. This indicated that the perpetrator was careful, used prepaid phones, and carefully planned his every move. Maureen was not a random victim. She was targeted, contacted, and lured into a trap. For her family, the 3.5 years of waiting were excruciating. They knew something was wrong, but with no body, no evidence, she was just a disappearing person in a system crowded with similar cases. When she was finally identified among the Gilgo Four, her family could finally begin the grieving process. Megan Waterman, young soul full of dreams. The third victim was 22-year-old Megan Waterman of Scarborough, Maine. Megan was the youngest of the 4 women, and her story is perhaps the most tragic, because the life she had yet to live was stolen from her. She disappeared in June of 2010, just 6 months before she was found. Megan was the mother of a 3-year-old daughter trying to piece her life back together. Like the other women, she worked as an escort and was active on Craigslist. She was staying at a hotel in Hauppauge, Long Island, and went to meet a client on June 3rd. She told her boyfriend she was going on a quick meeting and would be back by morning. She never arrived. Her boyfriend immediately reported her missing, but police had no leads at the time. Megan's phone was last seen in the Massapequa area, as were the phones of the other victims. This detail later proved crucial in identifying the perpetrator's geographic profile. Megan had a tattoo of her daughter's name reminding her why she was doing what she was doing. She worked in this profession not because she wanted to, but because she desperately needed money to support herself. She was a young woman trying to survive in an uneasy world, and she had fallen prey to someone who preyed on the most vulnerable. Amber Lynn Costello, warrior with a gentle soul. The fourth and final of the Gilgo Four was 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello of North Babylon, Long Island. Amber disappeared on September 9, 2010, just 3 months before the bodies were discovered. Of the 4 women, Amber was found last in line along Ocean Parkway. Amber was a complex person. She had a difficult life filled with personal struggles, including a drug addiction that she had battled for years. But she was also kind, caring, and loved her family. She lived with her boyfriend, Dave Schaller, in North Babylon and tried to improve her life, one day at a time. Like other victims, Amber worked as an escort through online advertising. On the evening of September 9th, she received a call from a client. Her boyfriend Dave later testified that he had a bad feeling that evening. Amber assured him that she would be fine, that it was just a routine appointment. He saw her get in her car and drive away. That was the last time he saw her alive. Dave immediately knew something was wrong when Amber didn't return. He reported her missing, but as with the other cases, the police didn't have many leads. When her body was found 3 months later, Dave was devastated. He later told the media that if the police had taken the disappearances of these women more seriously at the time, perhaps some of them could have been saved. Common connections. What connected the 4 women was not just their professions or the way they were found. They were all young, vulnerable, and working in a profession that put them in dangerous situations with strangers. All advertised on Craigslist, all disappeared after going to meet a client, and all were last seen or had their phones last intercepted in a similar area of Long Island. Forensic analysis showed that all 4 bodies were wrapped in the same type of burlap, indicating that the perpetrator used the same source of material. The bodies were placed at regular intervals, approximately 150 yards apart, as if the perpetrator was deliberately creating some sort of macabre pattern. They were found relatively close to the road, suggesting that the perpetrator wanted them to be discovered eventually. Perhaps it was part of his game, his need to show his power. All 4 women were identified through DNA analysis and dental records. The exact cause of death could not be determined due to advanced decomposition, but the absence of wounds on the bones suggested they were likely strangled or suffocated, methods that leave no trace on bone tissue. It was immediately clear to investigators that these were not random killings. They were dealing with a serial killer who was intelligent, organized, and had been hunting for at least 3 years. And as it soon became clear, the Gilgo Four were just the beginning of a much more horrifying story. Investigators thought they had found everything. 4 victims, 1 perpetrator, a clear MO. But what happened in the months that followed showed that this case was much, much worse than anyone could have predicted. What began as a search for 1 woman and ended with the discovery of 4 bodies soon turned into something that resembled a cemetery more than a crime scene. Extension of the search area, March and April of the year 2011. After a winter break when the search was hampered by weather conditions, investigators decided to expand the search perimeter in March. If the perpetrator had used this area to bury his victims, there was a real possibility that there could be more bodies. The Suffolk County Police Department deployed dozens of officers, forensic technicians, police dogs, and even helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. On March 11, 2011, a systematic search of the entire coastal strip from Oak Beach to Gilgo Beach and eastward to Cedar Beach and Tobay Beach began. GPR technology was used to detect anomalies in the soil where bodies may have been buried. The forensic anthropology team was prepared for the worst. And the worst did indeed come. On March 19th, search teams found a human skull near Tobay Beach, a few kilometers east of where Gilgo 4 was found. The skull lay separate from the body, indicating either advanced decomposition or that it had been deliberately separated. A few days later, on March 23rd, more partial human remains were found in the Cedar Beach area. On April 4th came another shocking discovery. Complete human remains found in thick brush near Oak Beach, where Shannon Gilbert had originally disappeared. But it wasn't Shannon's body. On April 11th, investigators found another skull and partial remains. The area had turned into a massive crime scene stretching across several miles of coastline. By the end of April, the total number of victims was a shocking 10. 10 lives ended and buried along this deserted beach. The media was in shock. The public was horrified, and investigators realized they were dealing with something much bigger than one serial killer with one type of victim. The variety of victims, not just women. What made this case even more disturbing was the diversity of the victims found. While the first 5 bodies fit the classic profile, young women working as escorts, the next 5 victims did not fit this pattern at all. Among the newly found remains was the body of an Asian man dressed in women's clothing. Investigators could not immediately identify him because there was no one in the missing persons database who matched that description. His remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, suggesting that he may have been at this location much longer than the Gilgo 4, perhaps 5, 10, or even more years. Even more disturbing was the discovery of the remains of a young child. A little girl who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The discovery of the child's remains changed the entire dynamic of the case. This was no longer just the murder of grown women who knowingly took risks with their profession. This was a child, innocent and defenseless. Investigators were shaken. Some of them had children of their own, and this finding affected them on a personal level. In addition to the child, the remains of several other women were found who could not be immediately identified. Some had been at the site so long that only bones remained. Forensic anthropologists have begun the painstaking work of reconstructing who these women were, how long they lay there, and how they died. Jessica Taylor, a victim split in 2. One of the most shocking victims was a woman later identified as Jessica Taylor. Jessica's remains were first partially discovered back in July of 2003 in Manorville, an area approximately 70 miles from Gilgo Beach. At that time, only the torso was found without the head, arms, and legs. The case remained unsolved for almost 8 years. When investigators found more human remains near Gilgo Beach in 2011, DNA analysis revealed something shocking. These remains belonged to Jessica Taylor. The perpetrator took the time to dismember and bury her body in 2 different locations dozens of miles apart. It suggested a new level of planning and organization. Jessica was 26 years old when she disappeared in July of the year 2003. She was from New York and, like the other victims, worked in the escort industry. She had a distinctive tattoo, a sun with glowing rays on her back, and the name Dawn on her right shoulder blade. These tattoos helped investigators link the two finds together. The fact that Jessica's body was found in two locations led investigators to theorize that there may be other locations where other victims may have been buried. Manorville became a second area of interest, and police teams began systematically searching that location as well. Valerie Mack, another split body. A woman later identified as Valerie Mack met a similar fate, although her full identification took much longer. Parts of her remains were first found in November of the year 2000 also in Manorville. Like Jessica, Valerie was missing her head, arms, and legs. The body had been professionally dismembered, suggesting that the perpetrator had either medical knowledge or experience with anatomy. In the year 2011, during a massive search in Gilgo Beach, additional body parts were found that DNA analysis linked to the remains found in Manorville in the year 2000. However, it took until the year 2020 before the victim was finally identified as 24-year-old Valerie Mack of New Jersey. Valerie disappeared in the year 2000 and was not reported missing because her family thought she had just moved elsewhere and lost contact. She was a mother of one and was trying to survive in tough economic conditions. The fact that no one reported her disappearance shows the tragic reality of many victims. They were marginalized women whose absence was not immediately noticed. Sandra Costilla, the oldest known victim. One of the most difficult cases to solve was the remains found in November of 1993 in North Sea Woods near Southampton on Long Island. The body of then 28-year-old Sandra Costilla was found bound and wrapped in a similar manner to later victims. Her case was filed as an unsolved murder, but for many years there was no connection to the other victims. Sandra was from Long Island and had lived a difficult life. She struggled with addiction and supported herself with odd jobs. On November 13, 1993, she was last seen alive. A few days later, her body was discovered by a hunter in a remote wooded area. It was only when investigators began reanalyzing all the old unsolved cases of women from Long Island and the surrounding area that similarities began to emerge. The method of binding, the type of material used, the geographical proximity, all pointed to a possible connection. DNA evidence and forensic analysis later confirmed that Sandra's case was likely linked to the same perpetrator. If Sandra was indeed the victim of the same killer, it meant that this person had been killing since the early 1990s, a full 20 years without detection. That was a frightening realization. Karen Vergata, Jane Doe No. 7, finally got a name. Among the remains found was a woman who was identified as Jane Doe No. 7. Her partial remains were first discovered back in April of 1996 on Fire Island, another popular coastal area of Long Island. The feet were found in a blue plastic bag. At the time, no one knew who this woman was. In the year 2011, during an extended search at Gilgo Beach, more human remains were found that DNA analysis linked to the 1996 find, but the victim's identity remained a mystery for nearly 30 years. It was not until August of 2023, through advanced genetic genealogy and collaboration with DNA databases, that Jane Doe No. 7 was finally identified as Karen Vergata. She was 34 years old when she disappeared from Manhattan in February of 1996. She worked in various bars and clubs, and her family reported her missing, but her case was lost among thousands of others. Karen's identification after 27 years finally brought closure to her family, but it also opened up new questions. If Karen disappeared in the year 1996, was the perpetrator active even earlier? How many other victims could there have been? The timeline of the murders. When investigators compiled a chronological timeline of all the victims, a frightening pattern emerged. The first known victim, Sandra, was murdered in the year 1993. Karen disappeared in the year 1996. Valerie in the year 2000. Jessica in the year 2003. Then there was a pause until the year 2007, when the Gilgo 4 series of murders began. First Maureen, then Melissa in the year 2009, and finally Megan and Amber in the year 2010. This timeline pointed to a perpetrator who had been murdering for at least 17 years. Some of the murders were close together, others were years apart. This indicated either that the perpetrator had a cooling-off period where he did not murder, or that there were other victims that had not yet been discovered. The geographic distribution of the discovery sites, Gilgo Beach, Manorville, Fire Island, North Sea Woods, were all on or near Long Island. This suggested that the perpetrator was someone local, someone who knew the area like the back of his hand, knew where he could safely bury the bodies and where he would not be disturbed. The area was transformed into a massive crime scene spanning hundreds of square kilometers. Investigators began using satellite imagery and historical footage to determine if there had been any suspicious activity in these areas in the past. Every piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, every bone was analyzed, every fiber was examined under a microscope. For the families of the victims, this was a period of endless waiting and uncertainty. Some got answers months later, others years later, and some are still waiting. This case has become one of the largest and most complex serial murder investigations in American history, and what began as 4 bodies on a beach has grown into a horrific mosaic of death stretching over 2 decades. When we look at this case from the perspective of criminal psychology, patterns begin to emerge that help us understand how this killer thought, how he chose his victims, and how he carried out his crimes. Let's look at a detailed analysis of who these women were and exactly how the perpetrator proceeded. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the communication trail. When we focus on Maureen, we discover fascinating yet terrifying details about how sophisticated this perpetrator was. Investigators discovered that there were exactly 16 communication exchanges between her cell phone and the phone they later identified as the intercept phone used by the perpetrator. These 16 contacts show us that the perpetrator was not impulsive. He was patient, methodical, and planned every step ahead. Imagine the scenario. The perpetrator probably first contacted Maureen through her ad, arranged a meeting, perhaps transferred her several times to see how reliable she was, how desperate she was for money, how much of a risk she was taking. Those 16 contacts could have included text messages, phone calls, maybe even canceled appointments. It all served one purpose. The perp was studying her, figuring out her habits, her weaknesses, her vulnerabilities. Maureen came to New York from Connecticut, which meant she traveled across state lines. She was out of her comfort zone, away from the people who knew her. That made her even more vulnerable. The perpetrator knew that. He picked women who didn't have a strong social network in the area where they worked, women whose disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed, whose absence wouldn't cause immediate alarm. The fact that her phone stopped transmitting in the Massapequa and Lindenhurst area gives us a geographic clue. The perpetrator probably drove her to the area, perhaps to his home or some other prearranged location. That's where the crime took place, and from there he transported her to the place where she was later buried. Melissa Barthelemy, psychological torture of the family Melissa's case reveals perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this perpetrator, his need not only to kill, but also to psychologically torture the survivors. The taunting phone calls to her 15-year-old sister Amanda were no accident. They were premeditated, cruel, and revealed a narcissistic personality who preyed on the suffering of others. The perpetrator called Amanda repeatedly. According to police reports, several of these calls took place in the weeks following Melissa's disappearance. He called from busy locations. Investigators later found that some of the calls were made from the Times Square area of Manhattan, where there was a huge background noise. This was no coincidence. The perpetrator knew that he couldn't be tracked in such a busy place, that cameras would pick up thousands of people, and that he would get lost in the crowd. During these calls, he would say things to Amanda like, "Do you know where your sister is?" or making sexually explicit comments about Melissa. Imagine the horror. A 15-year-old girl getting calls from her sister's killer who revels in her fear and helplessness. It wasn't just the killer. This was a sadist who needed to extend his gratification far beyond the act of murder itself. These calls also revealed something else. The perpetrator was technically proficient. He used prepaid phones that couldn't be easily traced. He called from different locations, never the same place twice. He knew how cell phone tracking worked and how to get away with it. That suggested someone with intelligence, perhaps with a technical background or experience in telecommunications. Amanda was traumatized by these calls to the point that she needed years of therapy. Her testimony later provided investigators with valuable information about the perpetrator's voice, his manner of speaking, and the background sounds during the calls. Every detail was important. Jessica Taylor. 2 places, 1 victim. Jessica's case reveals another aspect of the perpetrator's modus operandi: his need to control not only death but also the discovery of his victims. The fact that her body was split up and buried in 2 different locations 70 miles apart was neither coincidence nor practical necessity. It was a choice. The headless, armless, and legless torso found in Manorville in the year 2003 was a clear message. By removing the head and hands, the perpetrator made easy identification impossible. No teeth for dental records, no fingerprints. He thought that in this way the body would remain unidentifiable forever. He didn't count on the advances in DNA technology. The way the body was dismembered suggested a certain level of knowledge. It wasn't a haphazard chopping. The incisions were made at the joints, which requires either anatomical knowledge or experience in butchering meat. Investigators considered the possibility that the perpetrator may have worked as a butcher, surgeon, or had other experience with the anatomy of the human body. The choice of 2 different locations to bury the body parts also suggested that the perpetrator moved freely and frequently around Long Island. Manorville is an inland area, while Gilgo Beach is on the coast. The perpetrator knew both areas well enough to know where he could safely bury human remains without being seen. This suggested a local resident, someone who had lived on Long Island for a long time. Jessica's tattoo, the sun on her back and the name Dawn, was what finally helped tie the 2 places together. Even though the perp removed the head and hands, he forgot about the tattoo. That was his fault. One of the few mistakes he made. Sandra Costilla. The oldest clue. Sandra's case from the year 1993 gives us a glimpse of what the perpetrator may have looked like at the beginning of his career. If Sandra was indeed his first victim, then her murder represents a teaching moment for the perpetrator. The way her body was found, bound and wrapped, indicated planning, but perhaps not yet the level of sophistication we see in later victims. Sandra was found relatively soon after her death, suggesting that the perpetrator had not yet fully developed his methods of hiding the bodies. The North Sea Woods site was remote, but not as carefully chosen as later locations. This supports the theory that Sandra may have been one of the first, if not the first, victim. However, the way her body was bound indicated something important. The perpetrator had a need for control. The victim must have been bound, helpless, completely in his control. This is characteristic of rape motivated by power and control, not passion or rage. Sandra wasn't killed in the heat of passion. She was killed because the perpetrator wanted to feel power over life and death. The time gap between Sandra in the year 1993 and Karen in the year 1996 is 3 years. This is a relatively long gap that could indicate that the perpetrator was either out of the area or that he was trying to control his urges. But as it turns out, these pauses got shorter over time, which is typical of serial killers who need an increasingly frequent fix to satisfy their needs. Valerie Mack. The pattern repeats itself. Valerie was murdered in the year 2000, 7 years after Sandra and 4 years after Karen. Like Jessica, her body was professionally disinterred and buried in 2 places. Again, Manorville and Gilgo Beach. This repeating pattern tells us something fundamental. The perpetrator found a method that worked for him and stuck to it. Manorville became a sort of dumping ground for the body parts the perpetrator wanted to hide the longest. Inland location, dense woods, few people, the perfect place to hide evidence for a long time. Gilgo Beach served as a second location, perhaps because it was closer to where the perpetrator lived or worked. The fact that Valerie was not reported missing reveals another aspect of the perpetrator's strategy. He chose women that no one would actively seek out. Women without strong family ties, women who were marginalized, women whose disappearance could be explained as a voluntary departure. This required a certain level of social observation and selection. The perpetrator had to spend time studying his potential victims. He may have followed them, finding out about their lives, their families, their social connections. Only when he was convinced that their disappearance wouldn't cause immediate alarm did he strike. This level of planning and patience is characteristic of highly organized serial killers. Karen Vergata. Hidden for decades, Karen's case in 1996 shows us how successful the perpetrator was in hiding his crimes. Her feet, found in a blue plastic bag on Fire Island, remained unidentified for 27 years. For 27 years, her family didn't know what happened to her. For 27 years, the perpetrator walked free, knowing his secret was safe. The use of a plastic bag suggested a certain practicality. The perpetrator transported body parts in bags, probably in the trunk of a car, and then buried them in pre-selected locations. This required not only mental stamina, but also physical strength and logistical planning. He had to know when and where he could safely carry out these actions without being seen. Fire Island is another coastal location on Long Island, confirming the perpetrator's knowledge of the entire area. He knew about the remote locations on various parts of the island. He knew when those locations were least frequented. He knew how to get there and how to leave without leaving a trail. The fact that Karen worked in bars and clubs in Manhattan but her body was found on Long Island tells us that the perpetrator was willing to travel to his victims or lure them to Long Island under various pretexts. Maybe he promised a higher payment for a private party away from the city. Maybe he was offering transportation. Whatever it was, he was able to convince these women to travel with him to isolated areas from which there was no return, common characteristics of the victims. When we look at all the victims together, clear patterns emerge. They were all women between the ages of 20 and 40. Most of them worked in the sex industry or escort services. Most had addiction or financial problems that pushed them into risky situations. None of them had strong social networks that would immediately sound the alarm when they disappeared. This was no coincidence. The perpetrator actively sought out these women because of these characteristics. He knew that society often overlooked these women, that the police might not take their disappearances as seriously as those of ordinary citizens, that the media would not pay much attention to their cases. He picked victims where he had the best chance of escaping justice. His modus operandi evolved over the years. From the relatively simple burial of Sandra to the sophisticated dismemberment and distribution of Jessica and Valerie's bodies in multiple locations. He learned from his experiences, refined his methods, became increasingly cautious and increasingly dangerous, and the scariest part of it all is that it worked. He's been killing for at least 17 years, maybe longer, and no one's caught him. Until then. Imagine a situation where you're faced with one of the biggest serial murder cases in American history, dozens of pieces of evidence, thousands of hours of work, and yet the perpetrator seems like a ghost, untraceable, invisible, always one step ahead. That's what 13 years of the Gilgo Beach killer investigation looked like, a period filled with frustrations, dead ends, political pressures, and the undying hope that justice would eventually prevail. The creation of the Special Investigative Unit. The Suffolk County Police Department quickly realized that this was no ordinary murder case. The scope and complexity of the case required the creation of a specialized unit dedicated solely to this investigation. In the year 2011, the Gilgo Beach Task Force was officially established, an interdisciplinary team consisting of Suffolk County police detectives, FBI agents, forensic specialists, criminal psychologists, and technical experts. This unit was provided with the most advanced technology available at the time. They were assigned a special office in the police headquarters in Yaphank, where huge maps of Long Island were spread out on the walls with the locations of the finds marked, timelines, photographs of the victims, and endless documents. The room resembled a wartime command post where investigators met daily to analyze new evidence and plan their next steps. The task force had access to databases across the United States. They could match DNA samples against thousands of cases, check missing persons records across all states, and coordinate with local police departments across the country. It was a multi-million-dollar-a-year operation which showed how seriously authorities were taking this case. The leadership of the unit changed several times over the years, sometimes resulting in different approaches and strategies. Some leaders focused more on the technological aspects, others on traditional detective work. These changes sometimes slowed progress, because the new leadership needed time to become familiar with the extensive case materials. Mapping mobile phone movements. One of the key strategies of the investigation was the detailed mapping of the cell phone movements of all victims in their last days of life. Investigators obtained records from all the major telecommunications companies, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, and began reconstructing each victim's final hours. This work was incredibly complex and time-consuming. Every cell phone leaves a digital footprint every time it connects to a base station. Investigators had to analyze thousands of these records, create movement maps, and look for common patterns. They used specialized software that could visualize the phone's movements on maps in real time. They discovered fascinating patterns. Several victims' phones had last answered in similar areas of Nassau County and Suffolk County, specifically in the area around Massapequa, Lindenhurst, and Babylon. This suggested that the perpetrator lived or worked somewhere in the area, or that he had some safe place to carry out his crimes. Even more interesting was the discovery that some of the victims' phones were still in use after they disappeared. The perpetrator obviously didn't destroy them immediately, but kept them for some time. Maybe as trophies, maybe for practical reasons. Sometimes these phones would send signals from different parts of Long Island, indicating that the perpetrator moved around the area regularly. Investigators also discovered that the perpetrator used sophisticated methods to mask his identity. He used prepaid phones purchased with cash, changed them frequently, and never registered them in his name. Some phones were only activated for a short period of time, just long enough to contact the victim and arrange a meeting. DNA analysis, finding a genetic trace. Forensic laboratories worked with minimal samples of biological material found at crime scenes and on victims. Since some of the bodies were found after years of exposure to the weather, obtaining usable DNA was extremely challenging. Forensic technicians used state-of-the-art methods to extract DNA from degraded samples. Each sample was tested several times using different methods to ensure the accuracy of the results. Techniques such as STR, short tandem repeat analysis, mitochondrial DNA analysis for severely degraded samples, and the latest methods such as SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, analysis, which could work even with very small and damaged DNA samples, were used. Laboratories were also experimenting with new techniques such as epigenetic marker analysis, which could provide information on the age, lifestyle, and even geographical origin of the perpetrator. These methods were at the frontiers of scientific knowledge, and their results had to be interpreted with great care. Investigators created an extensive database of DNA profiles from all crime scenes and began comparing it with national databases such as CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. They also made comparisons with international databases in case the perpetrator had foreign origins or was recorded in other countries. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when they were able to obtain a partial DNA profile from a hair found on the burlap in which one of the bodies was wrapped. This profile became a kind of holy grail of the investigation. If a matching sample could be found, the case would be solved. Tracking the suspect's internet activity with the rise of the internet and social media, investigators also focused on the digital trail of the perpetrator. They analyzed Craigslist ads where victims offered their services and looked for patterns in communication with potential clients. This work required working with online providers and platforms. Investigators created fake profiles and advertisements to attract offenders if they were still actively seeking new victims. This operation, known as a honeypot operation, was conducted under the strict supervision of lawyers and ethics committees to ensure it did not cross legal boundaries. They also monitored online forums and chat rooms where the case was discussed. Sometimes serial killers engage in public discussions about their crimes, either to monitor the progress of the investigation or to enjoy media attention. A team of cyber experts analyzed thousands of posts and comments, looking for linguistic patterns and behavioral indicators that might reveal the perpetrators. Activity on pornographic and violent content sites was also monitored. Offender profiles often indicate consumption of specific types of content prior to committing crimes. Investigators worked with the providers of these services to identify users who were searching for content related to violence against women or specific practices that matched the modus operandi of the Gilgo Beach killer. Public and media frustration. As the years passed without an arrest, frustration grew not only among the families of the victims, but also in the broader Long Island community. People began to question the competence of the local police. Some families hired private detectives, while others organized their own searches and demonstrations outside police headquarters. The media regularly published articles criticizing the slow progress of the investigation. Journalists pointed out that if the victims had come from wealthier families or had not been involved in the sex industry, the case might have been solved more quickly. This criticism led to several internal audits and reorganizations of the investigation unit. Local communities began to organize their own security measures. Women working in escort services formed informal networks where they passed information about suspicious clients to each other. Some started using location tracking apps and agreed to regular check-in calls with friends during client meetings. The political pressure to solve the case was enormous. Local politicians faced criticism at every public appearance. Some promised to increase the budget for the investigation, others demanded federal involvement. This pressure sometimes led to hasty decisions and the pursuit of false leads just to show that something was wrong. Technological challenges and limitations. The investigations took place at a time of rapid technological development, which presented both opportunities and challenges. Some evidence was collected using technologies that were at the frontiers of scientific knowledge, which meant that its applicability in court was uncertain. For example, satellite imagery from different time periods showed changes in the landscape around the sites of the finds. Investigators could identify when new roads were created, when vegetation changed, or when new structures appeared. This information helped narrow down the time frame when the bodies may have been buried. Georadar technology made it possible to search large areas without digging. These instruments could detect anomalies in the soil that could indicate the presence of buried remains. Over the course of 13 years of investigation, several hundred square miles of Long Island were searched with GPR. Advances in artificial intelligence have made it possible to create predictive models of perpetrator behavior. Algorithms analyzed all the available data, locations of finds, temporal patterns, victim characteristics, and created probabilistic maps of where the perpetrator might be or live. International cooperation and consultation. The complexity of the case led to the involvement of international experts on serial killings. Investigators consulted colleagues in the UK where they had experience of similar cases, Canadian experts in geographic profile analysis, and Australian specialists in forensic genetics. Several international conferences were organized, with leading experts from around the world discussing the case. These events brought new perspectives and methodologies, but also showed how exceptional and complex this case was. Rarely in the world have investigators encountered such a prolonged, active, and cautious perpetrator. The cooperation with Interpol allowed comparison with similar cases in other countries. A special database containing the characteristics of the case was created and made available to police forces around the world. The aim was to identify possible similar crimes or to obtain information on perpetrators with a similar modus operandi. During the 13 years of the investigation, several generations of investigators have changed. Some retired, others were reassigned to other cases, and others joined with new ideas and energy. Each change brought new perspectives, but also risked a loss of institutional memory and continuity in the approach to the case. Despite all these efforts, modern technology, and international cooperation, the perpetrator remained elusive. 13 years of investigation had produced one of the most extensive databases of criminal evidence in American history, but justice was still waiting to be served. After 13 years of waiting, after thousands of hours of work and endless dead ends, the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. On July 13, 2023, something many had already thought impossible happened. The Gilgo beach killer was finally identified and arrested. Let's go over how this historic moment came about and who the man behind these horrific crimes is. A dramatic arrest in Midtown Manhattan. It was early Thursday afternoon when Rex Andrew Heuermann was walking the busy streets of Midtown Manhattan, presumably returning from work or a meeting. Little did he know that his every move was being watched by dozens of investigators waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. The operation had been planned with military precision. There could be no mistakes, no escape, no possibility that the suspect might flee or attempt suicide. FBI agents and Suffolk County police detectives surrounded him in the middle of a crowded sidewalk. Witnesses said it looked like a scene from an action movie. A black SUV suddenly stopped. Several men in bulletproof vests with police and FBI written on them jumped out, and within seconds had Heuermann on the ground in handcuffs. Passers-by pulled out their phones and filmed the scene, which appeared on social media within minutes. Heuermann did not defend himself according to reports. He didn't look surprised, but rather resigned, as if he knew this day would come. He was immediately taken to a police car and transported back to Long Island, where hours of questioning awaited him. The Manhattan street where the arrest took place was closed off for several hours, while forensic teams searched the area where Heuermann stood, looking for any evidence he might have discarded. News of the arrest spread with lightning speed. Local and national media interrupted their regular coverage with breaking news. The families of the victims received calls from investigators before the news hit the media. They finally had the answers they had been waiting years, in some cases decades, for. Arrestee profile: Rex Andrew Heuermann. When the public learned who the arrested man was, many people were shocked. Rex Andrew Heuermann was not homeless. He was not a social outcast living on the fringes of society. He was 59 years old, married with 2 grown children, and living a seemingly normal life in a suburban community. Heuermann lived in Massapequa Park, a quiet suburb on Long Island, in a house he had owned for several decades. Neighbors described him as a quiet, withdrawn man who didn't communicate much, but he wasn't suspicious or eccentric. Some remembered him as a man who took care of his house, mowed his lawn, and lived a low-key life. No one would have suspected him of such horrific crimes. His wife, whose name was initially protected by the media, worked as a teacher. The children were grown and living their own lives. According to later reports, the family was not present in the house at the time of the arrest. Heuermann had reportedly sent them on vacation out of state, which investigators saw as an opportune moment to intervene. What was perhaps most shocking was Heuermann's profession. He worked as an architect, owned his own firm called RH Consultants and Associates, which was based in Manhattan. His office was on Fifth Avenue, one of the most prestigious addresses in New York City. He worked on various projects around the city, including some landmark buildings. He was an educated, intelligent man with a successful career. Heuermann was tall. He was over 190 centimeters tall and had a sturdy build. He wore glasses and was often dressed in business casual clothes. At first glance, he looked like a typical New York professional, someone you would meet on the subway or in a coffee shop and not even notice. And it was perhaps in this inconspicuousness that his greatest danger lay. Key evidence: DNA from the pizza. The story of how the investigators finally got enough evidence to make an arrest is a fascinating example of modern forensic science and patient detective work. The breakthrough came through a combination of good old-fashioned police work and state-of-the-art genetic technology. Investigators had Heuermann on their radar for months before his arrest. Using genealogical databases and advanced DNA analysis, they narrowed the suspects down to several men living in the Nassau County and Suffolk County area. Heuermann was one of them, but they needed direct evidence, a sample of his DNA that they could compare to DNA found at the crime scenes. Here comes the famous pizza. In January of 2023, investigators began discreetly following Heuermann. Teams of detectives rotated shifts, tracking his movements between home and office, documenting his daily routine, waiting for an opportunity to get his DNA without him noticing. The opportunity came when Heuermann visited a Manhattan pizzeria. He ordered a pizza, ate a few slices, and threw the rest in a public trash can. As soon as he left, investigators immediately seized a paper plate containing the pizza pieces. There were traces of saliva on the edge of the pizza where Heuermann took a bite, a perfect source of DNA. The sample was immediately transported to the lab, where technicians isolated the DNA and began comparing it to DNA found on the burlap in which the victims' bodies were wrapped. The result was clear and conclusive. The DNA from the pizza matched the DNA from the hair found on the burlap with a 1 in a billion chance. That meant a virtually 100% match. But the investigators wanted to be absolutely certain. They continued to follow up and recovered other samples. A coffee cup that Heuermann had thrown away, a cigarette butt, a paper handkerchief. Each sample confirmed the original finding. They had it. Cell phone records and digital footprints DNA wasn't the only evidence. Investigators reconstructed a digital trace of Heuermann going back more than a decade, using advanced techniques to analyze historical data from telecommunications companies. They were able to place his phone near where some of the victims were last seen. Specifically, a cell phone registered in Heuermann's name was picked up by base stations in the Massapequa area at times that correlated with the disappearance of the 3 victims. That alone might not be enough evidence. After all, thousands of people live in Massapequa, but combined with DNA evidence and other findings, it made a strong case. Even more interesting was what investigators found when they analyzed his internet activity. Heuermann owned several email accounts, some of which he used exclusively for online activities he wanted to hide from his family. On one of those accounts, investigators discovered that he regularly followed news reports about the Gilgo Beach investigation. Not only did he read articles about the case, which could be explained as a common interest of a local resident, but he also sought information about the victims, their families, and even the specific investigators working on the case. He had saved articles about the victims' funerals, statements by their families, and the progress of the investigation. It was as if he was following his own work, enjoying the attention his crimes were getting. Searching for sadistic material. What investigators found in Heuermann's internet history was horrifying, even to seasoned detectives who had seen many horrors. Heuermann regularly searched for and downloaded extremely violent pornographic material aimed at torturing and humiliating women. This was not ordinary pornographic content. It was material depicting real or simulated violence, bondage, strangulation, and other sadistic practices. A forensic analysis of his computers — he had a work computer in his office and a personal computer at home — revealed hundreds, perhaps thousands of files with this type of content. Some of the files were several years old, indicating a long-standing fascination with violence against women. File metadata indicated that some were downloaded or viewed at times close to the time of the victim's disappearance. Even more disturbing was the discovery of material containing child pornography. This discovery automatically meant additional federal charges, since possession and distribution of child pornography is a serious federal crime. Investigators turned this evidence over to the FBI, which launched a parallel investigation into these crimes. Heuermann also sought information about murder techniques, how to dispose of the body, and forensic methods used by police. He read articles about other serial killers, studied their methods, their mistakes. It was clear that he was trying to learn from the mistakes of others so that he wouldn't be caught himself. Investigators also found searches for specific names of victims, their relatives, investigators. He sought information about the victims' families, where they worked, where they lived, what they said to the media. This level of surveillance and interest in the consequences of his actions indicated a narcissistic personality that fed off the attention and suffering he caused. The search of the Massapequa Park house. Simultaneous with the arrest, a warrant was issued to search Heuermann's Massapequa Park home. Forensic teams in white protective suits entered the 2-story house and began a systematic search that lasted several days. Neighbors watched shocked as boxes of evidence, bags of clothing, computers, phones, and other electronics were removed from the house. The house was surrounded by yellow police tape, and the street was closed to the public. The media gathered outside the house and filmed the investigators' every move. Exactly what was found in the house remained classified at first, but later reports said the search included the discovery of personal items belonging to some of the victims: jewelry, articles of clothing, personal documents. These trophies are typical of serial killers who keep items that remind them of their victims so they can relive the thrill of murder. In the garage and basement of the house, investigators found tools and materials that could have been used in the murders: different types of rope, burlap similar to what the bodies were wrapped in, cutting tools. Forensic analysis of those items was to show whether they contained the victim's DNA or other evidence linking them to the crimes. Particularly disturbing was the discovery that Heuermann had created a kind of room in the house that was hidden or separated from the rest of the house. The purpose of this room was not immediately clear, but investigators speculated that it may have served as a place where he kept the victims before their deaths, or where he prepared the bodies for burial. Community and media reaction. News of the arrest sent shockwaves throughout the Massapequa Park community. People who had lived next door to Heuermann for years could not believe that their neighbor could be responsible for such horrific crimes. Some neighbors told the media that Heuermann was quiet but polite, that he never showed any signs of violent behavior. Others, however, recalled minor oddities. One neighbor mentioned that Heuermann often left late at night and did not return until early morning. Another remembered that his house looked unkempt with overgrown grass and a messy garage, which contrasted with the otherwise tidy surroundings. Some mentioned that Heuermann didn't have many friends, that they never saw him at community events. The media immediately began a search for every detail of Heuermann's life. Reporters contacted his former classmates, work colleagues, distant relatives. Photographs emerged from his youth, from college, from his professional life. A picture was created of a man who had lived a double life all his life. On the surface, a successful professional and family man, underneath a cold-blooded serial killer. For the victims' families, the arrest was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, they finally had answers and hope for justice. On the other, it reopened old wounds and brought back painful memories. Some families held press conferences to express relief at the arrest, but also criticism of the police for taking 13 years to find the perpetrators. The arrest of Rex Heuermann was the end of a long search, but only the beginning of the next phase, a trial that would reveal the full extent of his crimes and bring ultimate justice to the victims and their families. The justice system could finally get down to business. After 13 years of waiting, it was time to bring the perpetrators to justice. But as you will see, the path to the truth was not a straightforward one, and the charges expanded incrementally as investigators uncovered more and more evidence linking Heuermann to other victims. On the 14th day of July in the year 2023, the day after his arrest, on the 14th of July, Heuermann was brought before the Suffolk County Court. The courtroom was packed, with media representatives from around the world, victims' families, members of the public, and dozens of police officers who had worked on the case for years. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, tension, and anticipation. Heuermann entered the courtroom in orange prison garb, handcuffed at the hands and feet. According to the journalists present, he looked tired, with unkempt hair and bristles on his face. It was a stark contrast to the neat business attire in which he had been arrested the day before. He sat between his attorneys and barely spoke during the entire hearing, only answering direct questions from the judge in monosyllables. State's Attorney Ray Tierney came forward and began to read the charges. His voice was firm, but the tension of the moment was evident. This was one of the biggest cases in the history of the county, and every word, every phrasing was important. The room fell silent as he began to describe the crimes Heuermann was accused of. The charges were shocking in their brutality and detail. Tierney described how the victims were found, how long ago they were buried, what evidence linked Heuermann to these crimes. Some of the victims' families cried, others sat petrified, absorbing every word. For many, it was the first time they had heard the full details of what happened to their loved ones. 3 counts of first-degree murder. The first wave of charges involved 3 women. Heuermann was charged with first-degree murder in the cases of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. First-degree murder in New York means premeditated murder with prior planning. It is the most serious charge in a murder case and carries the possibility of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The prosecutor explained in detail why these 3 cases were selected for the first charge. The evidence in these cases was the strongest. The combination of DNA, cell phone records, testimony, and physical evidence created an irrefutable case. Tierney presented the court with pages of documents showing a connection between Heuermann and each of these women. In Melissa's case, the prosecution had records showing that Heuermann used one of his prepaid phones to contact her to advertise on Craigslist. Data analysis showed that this phone was later used to call her sister. There was also evidence that Heuermann was searching for information about Melissa online for months after her disappearance. For Megan, the evidence was even more concrete. Investigators found photos of Megan from her online ads stored on Heuermann's computer. A timestamp showed that these photos had been downloaded days before her disappearance. In addition, cell phone data placed Heuermann in the area of the Hoposh Hotel where Megan was staying on the day of her disappearance. Amber was the last of the three, and her case had perhaps the strongest physical evidence. Hair found on the burlap in which her body was wrapped was genetically linked to Heuermann. The odds of that hair belonging to someone else were astronomically low, 1 in a few trillion. 3 counts of second-degree murder. In addition to first-degree murder, Heuermann was also charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder for the same 3 victims. Second-degree murder in New York involves premeditated murder, but does not necessarily involve prior planning or may have lesser circumstances than first-degree murder. Such double jeopardy is a common strategy in murder cases. They give the jury the opportunity to choose between different degrees of guilt if it becomes clear during the trial that the evidence does not fully support premeditated murder. It is a kind of insurance policy for prosecutors to ensure a conviction even if the defense challenges some aspects of the planning. The prosecutor explained to the court that double jeopardy also reflects the complexity of the case and the different interpretations of the evidence that can occur during a trial. Some evidence clearly pointed to pre-planned murders, such as the use of prepaid phones and the careful selection of victims. Other aspects of the case may have been interpreted differently. The judge listened to all the charges and then turned to Heuermann to ask him where he stood on the charges. The room fell silent again. Everyone waited for his reaction. Heuermann stood up, supported by his lawyers, and in a clear, firm voice declared, "Not guilty." That single word resonated through the courtroom. He pleaded not guilty to all 6 charges. The decision to remand him in custody, a debate on custody ensued. The defense asked for Heuermann's release on bail, arguing that he had strong ties to the community, long-term employment, and no prior criminal history. His attorneys argued that he is not a flight risk and that he has the right to be free until proven guilty. The prosecutor vigorously objected. Tierney presented arguments to the court as to why Heuermann should remain in custody. First, he faces a life sentence, which makes him an extreme flight risk. Second, he is charged with 3 brutal murders, making him a potential danger to society. Third, the investigation is still ongoing and there is concern that he could influence witnesses or destroy evidence if released. Tierney also mentioned that Heuermann has financial resources, a successful architecture firm, his own home, which could allow him to flee the country. He reminded the court that this case is being watched around the world and that releasing the defendant would send the wrong message to the public. The judge heard from both sides and after a short recess gave his decision. Heuermann will be held in custody without bail. The judge justified his decision on the seriousness of the charges, the potential risk of flight, and the protection of the public. Heuermann was immediately taken back to the Suffolk County Correctional Facility in Riverhead to await trial. January of the year 2024. Extension of the charges against Maureen. The investigation continued after the first indictment. Detectives continued to analyze evidence, conduct additional tests, and reconstruct Heuermann's activities over the years. In January of 2024, 6 months after the initial arrest, the charges were significantly expanded. The prosecutor called a press conference to announce that Heuermann would be charged with another murder, this time of Maureen Brainard Barnes. This charge was the result of months of additional forensic work and analysis of digital evidence. Investigators discovered another prepaid phone linked to Heuermann that was in use at the time of Maureen's disappearance in 2007. This phone was in contact with Maureen's phone on the 16 occasions I mentioned earlier. Advanced data analysis has finally made it possible to definitively link this phone to Heuermann. In addition, forensic teams reanalyzed the materials found in Heuermann's house and found fibers of clothing that genetically matched samples from Maureen's body. These fibers were microscopic and had been missed by the initial analysis, but more advanced techniques made it possible to identify them. Heuermann was brought to trial again, this time by video conference from the prison. He again pleaded not guilty. The accusation of Maureen's murder added another layer to an already complex case and increased the pressure on the defense. June of the year 2024, Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. The next major expansion of the charges came in June of the year 2024. This was perhaps the most dramatic announcement, as it involved cases that were over 20 years old. Heuermann was charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. These cases were particularly difficult because the physical evidence was minimal. The bodies were found many years ago, and most of the biological material had degraded. But investigators used state-of-the-art techniques that were not available when the bodies were originally discovered. In Jessica's case, the analysis of the cut wounds on the bones was crucial. Forensic anthropologists used 3D scanning and computer modeling to determine the type of tool that was used to dismember her body. This type of tool matched the tools found in Heuermann's garage. Microscopic analysis revealed metal particles on the bones that chemically matched the material of these tools. Sandra was the oldest case, and the evidence was the weakest, but investigators found files on Heuermann's computer that suggested he kept a kind of diary or record of his actions. These files were heavily encrypted and took months before cyber experts were able to decrypt them. They contained coded references to dates and locations that were consistent with Sandra's murder. In addition, geographic analysis showed that Heuermann lived or worked near where Sandra's body was found in the year 1993. His employment records showed that he was working on a project in the Southampton area at the time, which is only a few miles from North Sea Woods. These allegations pushed the timeline of Heuermann's crimes back another decade. If he was indeed responsible for Sandra's death in the year 1993, that meant he had been murdering for more than 30 years. That made him one of the longest active serial killers in American history. December of the year 2024. Valerie Mack. The last known expansion of the charges came in December of the year 2024, more than a year after the original arrest. Heuermann was charged with the murder of Valerie Mack, whose body, like Jessica's, had been split open and buried in multiple locations. The evidence in Valerie's case was similar to Jessica's, a combination of forensic bone analysis, tool comparison, and digital evidence. But there was something more. Investigators found photos of the locations where Valerie's body was later found on Heuermann's old computer, which he stored in the basement. These photos were dated before the bodies were discovered, which was extremely incriminating. Heuermann visited these sites before the bodies were officially discovered and photographed them. For the investigators, this was clear evidence that he knew where the bodies were because he had placed them there himself. The defense tried to argue that as an architect he often photographed various locations on Long Island for his projects, but the prosecution proved that these particular locations had no connection to his professional activities. With this last charge, Heuermann was formally charged with a total of 7 counts of murder. He faced multiple charges of both first and second-degree murder, which carried the possibility of multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Preparing for the main trial. While the charges were piling up, intense preparations for the main trial were underway. The defense hired a team of forensic experts to challenge the prosecution's evidence. They argued that the DNA evidence may have been contaminated, that the geographic data from the cell phones was not accurate enough, that the digital evidence may have been tampered with. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to build its case. They prepared hundreds of witnesses, forensic technicians, detectives, mobile technology experts, psychologists, and of course, the families of the victims. Every aspect of the case had to be perfectly prepared because the defense was sure to exploit every ambiguity, every gap in the evidence. The judge set a tentative date for the main trial, but everyone knew that a case of this complexity would take months, maybe years. Jury selection alone would be extremely difficult. Finding 12 people who hadn't heard anything about the case would be almost impossible given the media coverage. Heuermann remained in custody, awaiting his day in court, while the whole world watched every development in this case that has become a symbol of the long road to justice. Now let's take a look at the fascinating world of modern forensic science and the investigative techniques that were used to solve this case. It is an amazing example of how technology and human perseverance can work together to bring justice decades later. Mapping cellular signals in Midtown Manhattan and Massapequa Park. One of the most sophisticated techniques used in this case was the detailed analysis of cell signals and their geographic mapping. The investigators were working with a massive amount of data from 2007 to 2010, which presented a technical challenge of monumental proportions. Every mobile phone, when switched on, is constantly communicating with nearby base stations, even when not in active use. These signals leave a digital trail that can be used to reconstruct the movement of the phone in space and time. Investigators obtained historical data from all major operators and began a careful analysis. Midtown Manhattan presented a particular challenge because of the density of base stations. In this area, stations are spaced very close together due to the high concentration of users, which paradoxically allows for much more accurate localization than in less densely populated areas. When investigators analyzed the signals from phones used to make prank calls to victims' families, they were able to place them on specific blocks, sometimes even on specific sides of the street. The triangulation technology they used works by measuring signal strength and response time between the phone and several base stations simultaneously. Advanced algorithms then calculate the phone's most likely location to within tens of meters. In the case of the Times Square calls, they were able to determine not only the exact area, but also the approximate elevation, indicating that the caller was at street level, not in a building. In Massapequa Park, the situation was different. This suburban area has a less dense network of base stations, which meant less accuracy, but still enough to create useful geographic profiles. Investigators created so-called heat maps, showing the areas with the highest frequency of signals from the suspect phones. These maps clearly showed clusters of activity around certain addresses, including Heuermann's house and his regular routes. Of particular interest was the analysis of temporal patterns. The suspicious phones showed activity mainly at night and on weekends. This activity correlated with times when Heuermann's wife and children were likely to be out of the house or asleep. This suggested that the perpetrator was planning his activities to avoid the attention of his family. Forensic genetics at the limit. The burlap in which the bodies were wrapped has become a gold mine of forensic evidence, but working with it has been extremely challenging. After years of exposure to weather, moisture, bacteria, and decay, most of the biological material had degraded almost beyond use. Forensic geneticists had to use state-of-the-art techniques to extract DNA from minimal samples. They started with a method called low copy number DNA analysis, which can work with just a few cells. This method is controversial because it increases the risk of contamination and false positives, so each test had to be run many times with different control samples. The hairs found on the burlap presented a particular challenge. If the hair contains a root, DNA analysis is relatively straightforward. But most of the hairs found were rootless, which meant the technicians had to work with mitochondrial DNA from the hair shaft. Mitochondrial DNA is less specific than nuclear DNA. It is inherited only from the mother and is shared by all maternal relatives, but it can still provide strong evidence. The extraction process involved first thoroughly cleaning each hair under a microscope to remove any contaminants. The hairs were then chemically treated to release the DNA, which was then amplified using the polymerase chain reaction, PCR. This process produces millions of copies of specific DNA sequences, allowing them to be analyzed. The investigators also used a technique called touch DNA on the burlap itself. When a person touches an object, it leaves a microscopic amount of skin cells on it. This technique is sensitive enough to detect DNA from just touching it, but it is also very susceptible to contamination. Therefore, the technicians had to work in sterile conditions, and each sample was tested against the DNA of all the investigators and technicians who came into contact with the evidence. The statistical analysis of DNA matches is fascinating in itself. When experts say that the probability of a random match is 1 in a few trillion, they are basing it on complex calculations based on the frequency of specific genetic markers in the population. In Heuermann's case, 13 to 20 different genetic loci were analyzed, and each added another order of magnitude to the probability of a unique identification. Tracking the suspect's internet activity. Digital forensic analysis of Heuermann's computers and online activity revealed a frightening glimpse into the mind of the perpetrator. The team of cyber experts worked with terabytes of data from multiple computers, tablets, smartphones, and cloud storage. The first step was to create forensically clean copies of all the hard drives. This meant using special hardware that can read every bit of data without any modification to the original. These copies were then analyzed using specialized software such as EnCase or FTK, Forensic Toolkit, which can also recover deleted files and reconstruct usage history. The Internet history was particularly revealing. Although Heuermann used incognito mode and regularly deleted his browser history, the digital forensics experts were able to recover these records from temporary files, cache memory, and system logs. They discovered thousands of searches related to the case, the victims, and forensic techniques. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of specific search terms. Heuermann searched for the names of detectives working on the case, their family members, even their home addresses. He studied investigators' social media profiles, followed their career paths. It was like playing a game with them, enjoying the feeling of being one step ahead. File metadata provided valuable temporal information. Every file on the computer contains timestamps, when it was created, last modified, last opened. Analysis of this data revealed patterns of behavior. For example, the disappearance of each victim was followed by a period of intense searches for case reports. Heuermann also downloaded and saved articles about the victims' funerals, as if he were building up a sick collection of memorabilia. Experts also analyzed the use of encryption tools. Heuermann used VPN services, encrypted email accounts, and secure file deletion software. This indicated a high level of computer literacy and awareness of digital forensics. But he made several key mistakes. For example, he didn't use VPNs consistently and sometimes forgot to delete temporary files. Cloud storage presented another layer of complexity. Heuermann had accounts with several providers: Google Drive, Dropbox, iCloud. Investigators had to obtain court orders for each service and then face technical challenges in downloading and analyzing that data. Some of the files were heavily encrypted and took weeks or months before experts were able to decrypt them. Searching for information on victims and their relatives. One of the most frightening aspects of the digital analysis was the discovery of the extent to which Heuermann had tracked not only his victims, but their families as well. They found files organized by victims' names, containing photos, articles, personal information, and even copies of their social media posts. Heuermann apparently kept a sort of dossier on each victim. These files contained screenshots of their online ads, photos from their social media profiles, and information about their family members. In some cases, he had photos stored from public events that families held in memory of the missing women. Particularly horrifying was the discovery that Heuermann had followed the younger sister of one of the victims on Facebook. He had saved photos of her, posts about her studies, about her friends. Investigators had to contact this young woman and inform her that her sister's killer was actively stalking her online. For her, it was a traumatic discovery that caused her to leave social media altogether. An analysis of email communications revealed that Heuermann used several pseudonyms and false identities online. Under these identities, he contacted escorts, arranged meetings, and asked about their availability and prices. Linguistic analysis of these emails, the way they were written, the words used, the grammatical patterns, all consistently pointed to the same author. Experts also discovered that Heuermann used advanced social engineering techniques. He created fake profiles on different platforms, posing as different people, sometimes as a potential client, sometimes as a colleague in the industry, or even as a journalist writing about sex worker safety. In this way, he obtained information about women, their habits, their fears, their vulnerabilities. Modern forensic methods versus old cases from the 1990s. One of the biggest challenges of the investigation was applying modern forensic methods to evidence that was 20 to 30 years old. The science of forensic analysis has changed dramatically in that time, and investigators have had to work with materials that were collected and preserved according to standards that are now considered outdated. In the Sandra Costilla case of 1993, the original forensic samples were stored in less than ideal conditions. The freezers in which the biological samples were stored failed several times over the years, causing the materials to partially thaw and refreeze. This led to the degradation of DNA and the destruction of much potentially useful evidence. But modern technology has made it possible to extract information even from these degraded samples. A technique called whole genome amplification can take tiny amounts of DNA and produce enough material for a complete analysis. This method was not available in the 1990s, but is now a standard part of the forensic arsenal. Skeletal remains from old cases have been reanalyzed using state-of-the-art techniques. Isotope analysis of bones can provide information about where the victim spent the last years of his life, what type of diet he had, even what medications he may have taken. This information has helped to create more detailed profiles of the victims, confirming or disproving various theories about their lives and deaths. Textile fibers found on the old evidence were re-examined using electron microscopy and spectroscopic analysis. These techniques can identify specific types of fibers, dyes, and chemicals with incredible accuracy. In several cases, fibers from the victim's clothing have been linked to fibers found in Heuermann's house or car. Photographic documentation from the original crime scenes has been digitized and processed using modern image enhancement techniques. The software can highlight details that were not visible in the original photographs or combine multiple images to create 3D models of the crime scenes. These models allowed investigators to go back to crime scenes and look for overlooked evidence. Comparative analysis of all cases revealed consistent patterns that were not apparent when each case was studied individually. When the investigators laid all the cases side by side and used data analytics to look for common elements, clear signals emerged: the same types of knots in the ropes, similar ways of wrapping the bodies, a consistent choice of burial sites. Psychological profile and behavioral analysis. The FBI was involved in developing a detailed psychological profile of the perpetrator based on analysis of crime scenes, victim selection, and modus operandi. Behavioral analysts from the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico studied every aspect of the crimes and created a profile that proved to be strikingly accurate. The profile predicted a middle-aged, intelligent man, probably college-educated, employed in a profession requiring planning and organization. He was predicted to live a double life, outwardly normal, perhaps married with children, but with a secret dark side. He also predicted that the perpetrator would be narcissistic, with a need for control and power games, which explained the taunting calls to families. The geographic profile, created using sophisticated algorithms, predicted that the perpetrator would live or work in the area between the crime scenes. This type of analysis is based on the theory that serial killers usually operate in an area they know well, but not directly where they live, creating a kind of buffer zone around their home. In Heuermann's case, this profile proved accurate. He lived in Massapequa Park, which was in the center of the area where the victims were found. Analysis of the time intervals between murders suggested a pattern called the cooling-off period, the period between murders when the perpetrator lives a normal life. These periods became progressively shorter, which is typical of serial killers who need an increasingly frequent fix to satisfy their urges. This pattern helped investigators predict when the perpetrator might strike again and focus their search on specific time periods. All of these methods combined to create a comprehensive picture of not only the crimes themselves, but also the man who committed them. It was a combination of good old-fashioned detective work, cutting-edge science, and human intuition that finally brought Rex Heuermann to justice after 13 years of investigation. Despite the arrest and extensive investigation, many aspects of the case remain shrouded in mystery. Some questions may never be answered. Others may come to light during the trial. Let's take a look at what we still don't know, and what is of greatest curiosity to investigators and the public. How many victims does the Gilgo Beach killer really have? This may be the most pressing question of all. Heuermann is formally charged with 7 murders, but there is a strong possibility that there were many more victims. Investigators have discovered a total of 10 bodies in the Long Island area, which means 3 victims remain officially unconnected to Heuermann. Are these victims also part of his works, or was there more than one serial killer operating on Long Island? Particularly mysterious is the body of an Asian man found wearing women's clothing. This case is very different from the others. Different gender, different ethnicity, different way of dressing. Could Heuermann be responsible for this murder as well? If so, why did his pattern change so dramatically? Or was there a second perpetrator who used the same area to bury his victims? The young child found among the victims poses another terrifying question. Genetic analysis showed that the child was related to one of the adult victims, possibly her daughter. Does that mean Heuermann killed the mother and child together? Did the child witness her mother's murder and have to be eliminated? Or was the murder committed in a different context? This is a particularly painful question, and investigators hope to get answers during interrogations or the trial. But the question goes further. If Heuermann murdered from the year 1993 to the year 2010, a period of 17 years, it is statistically unlikely that he had only 7 victims. Most serial killers who are active for that long have many more victims. Are there other bodies that haven't been discovered yet? Are there other burial sites that no one knows about? Investigators are studying unsolved cases of missing women from all over the northeastern United States. They're focusing on cases of women working in the escort industry who disappeared while Heuermann was active. Several of the cases show similarities. The women disappeared after making an appointment with a client. Their phones stopped transmitting signal in the Long Island area or surrounding counties, and then the ground was covered. There's also a theory that Heuermann may have murdered outside of Long Island. As an architect, he traveled all over New York and possibly other states for work projects. Could he have used these trips to commit other crimes in areas where they wouldn't be connected to the Long Island cases? The FBI is analyzing unsolved cases in locations where Heuermann worked on projects, but no connections have yet been confirmed. Is the Shannon Gilbert case related to Heuermann? Shannon Gilbert is the woman whose disappearance triggered the entire search that led to the discovery of the Gilgo 4 and all the other bodies. Her story is tragic and mysterious and remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the entire case. Shannon was last seen alive in Oak Beach, where she called 911 screaming that someone was trying to kill her. Witnesses saw her running down the street, banging on doors of houses and begging for help. Then she disappeared. Her body was found 18 months later in a swampy area near where she was last seen. The official investigation initially concluded her death was an accidental drowning or drug overdose. They claimed there were no signs of violence and that her death was unrelated to the Gilgo 4 murders. But her family and many investigators disagree with that conclusion. They point out that it's too much of a coincidence that her search led to the discovery of a serial killer operating in the same area. There are some discrepancies in the official version. For example, her bones were scattered over a wide area which the family argues would not have been possible in a simple drowning. Some parts of her body have never been found. The audio recording of her 911 call has never been fully released, raising suspicions about what exactly she said. If Shannon was Heuermann's victim, it would change the entire timeline of the case. Her death would be the last known murder in the series, committed in May of 2010. That would mean Heuermann was still active and hunting at the time the police began to discover his previous victims. Would he be so arrogant or desperate as to risk another murder in the midst of an intense police search? Or is it possible that Shannon's death was truly an unfortunate accident, a bizarre coincidence that happened in the same area where the serial killer was operating? Statistically, it seems unlikely, but not impossible. Investigators are still examining the evidence, and perhaps new information will come to light during the trial or further investigation. Shannon's family is demanding that her case be reopened and thoroughly investigated in light of Heuermann's arrest. They want new forensic tests to be conducted to formally link her case to the other murders. For them, there is no closure until they have definitive answers. Are there other unidentified victims? In addition to Shannon, there are other unidentified victims found in the Gilgo Beach area. Even after years of forensic work, DNA testing, and identification efforts, some victims remain nameless. Who were these women? Where did they come from? Does anyone have them missing? One of the unidentified victims has been identified as Jane Doe No. 6. Her remains were so degraded that forensic anthropologists could only determine her approximate age and height. They don't have a DNA profile of sufficient quality to compare with databases. No teeth for dental records. It's as if this woman never existed in any official records. Investigators are using a technique called genetic genealogy, the same method that helped catch the Golden State Killer in California. They are uploading partial DNA profiles to public genealogical databases and searching for distant relatives who could lead to an identification. But the process is long, expensive, and not always successful. There is also the issue of tattoos and other identifying marks. Some victims have had tattoos, but if the body has been buried for a long time, the skin breaks down and the tattoos disappear. Forensic artists try to reconstruct what these women looked like, creating drawings and 3D models of their faces based on the skulls. These reconstructions are then published in the media in the hope that someone will recognize them. But what if there are victims who haven't even been discovered yet? Long Island is big, hundreds of square miles of forests, swamps, abandoned areas. Heuermann has had 30 years to hide bodies in places no one has ever found. Some areas are so dense and impenetrable that it's almost impossible to search them systematically. Investigators use GPR, metal detectors, even specially trained dogs to search for other burial sites. They're tracking Heuermann's movement history, where he worked, where he traveled, where he owned or rented property. Each of these sites is a potential location where other bodies could be. How long has he been killing without detection? The timeline of Heuermann's crimes is still not entirely clear. If Sandra Costilla was indeed his first victim in the year 1993, that means he had been murdering for 17 years before his arrest. But was Sandra really the first, or were there victims before her? Heuermann was born in the year 1964, which means he was 29 years old in the year 1993. Most serial killers start killing in their late 20s or early 30s, so the age would fit. But some start much earlier, in their late teens or early 20s. Investigators are combing through old cases from the 80s, looking for similarities to Heuermann's MO. They focus on unsolved murders of young women in the New York and Long Island area. Several cases show some similarities, but have not yet been definitively linked to Heuermann due to a lack of DNA evidence or other physical clues. There is also the question of how Heuermann developed as a killer. Most serial killers start with less sophisticated crimes and become more sophisticated over time. If Sandra was his first, her murder was already fairly organized and sophisticated. That suggests either he had previous experience with violence or that he's extremely intelligent and naturally cautious. Could there have been failed attempts, women who escaped, or situations where something went wrong and he couldn't complete the murder? If so, these women could provide valuable information about his methods and behavior. Investigators search police reports for assaults, attempted abductions, or suspicious encounters in areas and times relevant to the case. Why these women in particular? While we know that Heuermann targeted women working in the escort industry, we still don't know why he chose these particular women. There were thousands of women advertising on Craigslist at the time. What made Heuermann contact Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Amber, and the others? Were there any specific physical characteristics that attracted him? All of the victims were Caucasian, most had blonde or auburn hair, most were of similar height and build. This suggests a certain type that Heuermann preferred. But why this type? Did they remind him of anyone in his life? Did he have any traumatic experiences with women of this appearance? Or was the choice based more on practical considerations? Maybe he chose women who were willing to travel to Long Island for a higher payment. Maybe he preferred women who worked independently rather than for an agency because they were more vulnerable. Maybe he was looking for women with certain personal circumstances, single mothers in need of money, women with addiction problems, women without strong social ties. An analysis of his online communications with victims could reveal patterns. How long did he communicate with each woman before meeting her? What questions did he ask? What demands did he make? These communications could provide insight into his thought process and exactly what he was looking for. There's also the question of whether he ever contacted women he didn't end up meeting. Perhaps he had a list of potential victims and chose based on their responses or availability. Maybe some of the women turned him down or seemed too risky. Identifying these women could help us understand his selection process. Are there other places with victims? The fact that bodies have been found in several different locations, Gilgo Beach, Manorville, Fire Island, North Sea Woods, raises the question of whether there are other locations that have not yet been discovered. Heuermann knew Long Island intimately, having lived there all his life, working as an architect on projects all over the island. He had extensive knowledge of the geography, the remote areas, the places where he could safely bury bodies. investigators created maps of all the projects Heuermann worked on during his career. Each building, each project represents a potential area of interest. If he worked on a project in a certain area, he had a legitimate reason to be there. He could study the terrain. He could identify suitable sites. Some of these sites are hundreds of square kilometers and would take years to search. Special attention is paid to areas where Heuermann owned or rented property. Did he have other properties besides his main house in Massapequa Park? Did he rent warehouses or garages? Did he have access to buildings or land through his work? Each of these locations is being systematically explored. There is also a theory that some of the bodies may have been buried on private land that Heuermann did not own but to which he had access. Perhaps plots of friends or family members, abandoned buildings where he worked, or even public parks and preserves he knew well. Identifying all these places is a monumental task. Satellite images from different time periods are analyzed by artificial intelligence to look for anomalies, changes in the soil, vegetation, or terrain texture that might indicate a body has been buried. The technology is still relatively new and not always accurate, but it provides clues for physical searches. Some investigators speculate that Heuermann may have also used water surfaces to bury bodies. Long Island is surrounded by water, the Atlantic Ocean, Long Island Sound, dozens of lakes and reservoirs. Bodies buried in water decompose faster and are harder to find. Dive teams search some of the water in areas associated with Heuermann, but it's extremely difficult and dangerous work. The answers to these questions may come out during the trial if Heuermann decides to talk. Some serial killers end up confessing their crimes and even helping investigators find the bodies, perhaps out of a need for attention or a desire for some kind of legacy. Others never talk and take their secrets to their graves. Only time will tell which category Rex Heuermann falls into. This case is not just a matter for courtrooms and police departments. Its impact has spread far beyond Long Island and changed the way we think about safety, justice, and the value of human life. Let's walk through how this case has impacted different aspects of our society, the importance of this case to serial murder investigations. The Gilgo Beach killer case has become a textbook example of modern serial murder investigation and is now studied in police academies and universities around the world. It has shown how a combination of traditional detective methods and the latest technology can produce results even in cases that seemed unsolvable. The FBI's police academies at Quantico have incorporated the case into their curriculum for investigators specializing in serial crimes. Students analyze what worked and what didn't, how investigations could have been more effective, and what lessons can be learned for the future. Special attention is paid to interdisciplinary collaboration, how different agencies and disciplines must work together on such a complex case. The case also demonstrated the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases. 13 years is a long time, but the persistence of the investigators eventually brought justice. It sent an important message to both the perpetrators that time is not their ally, and to the families of the victims that their loved ones are not forgotten. Many police departments across the United States have reopened old cases following the model of the Gilgo Beach success. Creating specialized units for long-term investigations has become a priority for many counties. The Suffolk County Task Force has become a model for how such a unit should operate, with dedicated resources, access to the best technology, and a team of experts in various fields. Other regions are now looking to replicate this model for their own backlogs. The international community of investigators has also benefited from this case. Conferences and symposia on serial homicide now regularly include presentations on the Gilgo Beach case. Investigators from Europe, Asia, and Australia are studying the methods used to solve this case and adapting them for their own jurisdictions. New protocols for evidence preservation, data analysis, and international cooperation have emerged. The role of modern technology in uncovering the perpetrator. This case represents a watershed moment in forensic science and demonstrates how technology has dramatically changed the landscape of criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy, which was key to identifying Heuermann, is a relatively new technique that was first widely used in the capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018. The Gilgo Beach case demonstrated that this method is not a one-time success, but a new standard in investigation. Public genealogical databases such as GED Match and Family Tree DNA have become unexpected tools for law enforcement. Millions of people have uploaded their DNA to these databases to find distant relatives or research their ancestry, not realizing that this data can be used to identify criminals in their family trees. This has sparked important debates about privacy, ethics, and the limits of police surveillance. Legislation has had to adapt to these new realities. Some states have passed laws specifically regulating the use of genetic data in criminal investigations. There is debate about whether police need a court order to access these databases, whether they must inform users that their data may be used in this way, and what protections exist against misuse. Mobile phone tracking and data analysis have also proved invaluable. This case demonstrated how historical data from telecommunications companies can be used to reconstruct suspects' movements even years back. This has led to debates about data retention, how long companies should keep these records, and who should have access to them. Digital forensics has reached a new level of sophistication in this case. The ability to recover deleted files, decrypt encrypted communications, and analyze metadata has become critical. This forced technology manufacturers to rethink their security protocols. There is an ongoing tension between protecting user privacy and providing law enforcement with the tools to fight crime. Artificial intelligence and machine learning have begun to play a role in analyzing massive amounts of data. Algorithms can identify patterns and connections that human analysts might miss. In this case, AI helped analyze thousands of hours of security camera footage, phone records, and internet activity. This technology is still evolving, and the next generation of investigations will depend even more on these tools. Security alerts for vulnerable groups. This case has brutally illuminated the dangers faced by women working in the sex industry. All of Heuermann's known victims were escorts, women who often work in isolation, without protection, and with minimal legal assistance. Their deaths sparked a national conversation about how society protects, or rather fails to protect, these vulnerable women. Sex worker rights advocacy groups have used this case as a catalyst for change. They argue that if sex work were legalized and regulated, women would have greater protection. They could work in safer conditions, with the ability to report violence to the police without fear of arrest. They could share information about dangerous clients without fear of legal repercussions. New safety protocols and apps specifically designed to protect sex workers would emerge. Apps such as Safety Pin or Companion allow women to share their location with trusted contacts, set up timed checks, and quickly call for help in case of danger. Online forums and sex worker communities have created blacklists of suspicious or dangerous clients. Safety education programs have proliferated. Workshops teach women how to screen clients, how to set up safe appointments, what warning signs to look for, and how to respond in dangerous situations. These programs emphasize that no money is worth the loss of life, and that it's okay to turn down a client who makes you feel uncomfortable. Health and social services have also expanded their programs aimed at sex workers. They recognize that many women enter the profession because of economic necessity, addiction, or other difficult circumstances. They offer alternative employment opportunities, addiction treatment, psychological support, and help to leave the industry for those who want to. The case also highlighted the problem of missing persons from marginalized communities. When Maureen, Melissa, Megan, or Amber disappeared, their cases did not receive immediate massive media attention. There were no searches with thousands of volunteers, no primetime specials on CNN. This is in stark contrast to the cases of the disappearances of young, middle-class white women, which usually get huge media attention. This phenomenon, called missing white woman syndrome, is now widely discussed and criticized. The families of the victims are waiting for justice. For the families of the 7 confirmed victims, and perhaps others not yet connected to the case, the arrest of Heuermann was the beginning of a painful new chapter in their lives. After years of uncertainty, after endlessly waiting for answers, they finally know who is responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. But knowing the truth brings its own kind of pain. Families have had to come to terms with the horrific details of what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. They have had to hear about the manner of their deaths, how their bodies were found, the sadistic aspects of the crimes. For some parents, this knowledge was almost unbearable. They would rather remain in limbo than face the horrific reality. The trial represents another trauma. Families will have to sit in the courtroom and listen to every detail, see photographs of crime scenes, hear testimony from forensic experts about the condition of their loved ones' bodies. They will have to face the possibility of seeing Heuermann in person, the man who destroyed their lives. Some families choose to attend every hearing, others can't handle it mentally and stay home. Support groups for families of serial killer victims have become vital. These families share a unique experience that few others can understand. They provide each other with emotional support, practical advice on navigating the legal system, and a space to grieve without judgment. Some of these groups have become vocal advocates for change in how the system treats victims' families. The financial impacts are also significant. Many families have spent thousands of dollars on private investigators during years of searching. Now they face the cost of travel to court hearings, perhaps for trauma management therapy and legal representation if they want to participate in the process as victims. Some communities have set up funds to help these families, but the financial burden remains enormous. There are also complex dynamics around media attention. Some families welcome the media as a way to keep the memory of their loved ones alive and push the system for justice. Others feel exploited by a media that reduces their loved ones to sensational headlines and morbid details. Navigating this attention while grieving is incredibly challenging. For the children of victims, and some victims have left young children, the situation is especially difficult. How do you explain to a child that their mother was murdered by a serial killer? How do you protect a child from the media circus while allowing them to grieve? Some of these children are now adults and must deal with the trauma that shaped their entire childhood. The trial is still ongoing. At the time of this video, the trial against Rex Heuermann is still ongoing. The main trial has not yet begun and is expected to last for months, possibly years. The complexity of the case, the amount of evidence, and the seriousness of the charges mean that this will be one of the longest-running and most watched trials in recent history. Jury selection will be a monumental task in itself. Finding 12 people who have heard nothing about the case or have no pre-formed opinion will be almost impossible. The case has been covered by media around the world. Everyone on Long Island knows the name Rex Heuermann. The judge will have to carefully select jurors who can be impartial despite the massive media coverage. The defense faces an almost impossible task. The DNA evidence is strong, the digital trail is extensive, the circumstantial evidence is piling up, but they have an obligation to provide the best possible defense for their client. They will likely question the reliability of the DNA tests, argue contamination of the evidence, challenge the chain of custody of the materials, and try to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. The prosecution is tasked with proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for each of the 7 murder charges. That means presenting hundreds of pieces of evidence, dozens of witnesses, and creating a coherent narrative that ties all the pieces together. They must be prepared for every defense strategy and be able to explain complex forensic science in a way that jurors without a scientific background can understand. There is also the possibility that Heuermann will eventually plead guilty in a plea deal. Some serial killers end up confessing to their crimes in exchange for avoiding the death penalty or certain prison benefits. If Heuermann pleads guilty, it would spare the families the trauma of a trial, but it would also deprive them of the opportunity to hear all the details and see him brought to public justice. The verdict, whatever it is, will have far-reaching consequences. If found guilty, Heuermann is likely to receive several consecutive life sentences, meaning he will spend the rest of his life in prison. If he is somehow acquitted, which seems highly unlikely given the strength of the evidence, it would cause a public uproar and probably lead to a rethink of the entire investigation. Reminders of the victims. They were not just numbers, but people with families and dreams. In the media circus around the arrests, in the technical discussions about DNA and forensic evidence, in the legal debates about charges and trials, it is easy to forget the most important aspect of this case: the victims themselves. It wasn't just statistics. It wasn't just the Gilgo 4 or Jane Doe number 7. They were real human beings with names, stories, dreams, and people who loved them. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was a mother who loved her daughter more than anything in the world. She worked hard to give her a better life. She had a sense of humor that made everyone in the room laugh. She loved music and dancing. Her family remembers her not as a victim, but as a strong, kind woman who did her best in difficult circumstances. Melissa Barthelemy had a younger sister whom she adored. She had big dreams of a future outside of New York, a place where she could start over. She had an infectious laugh and a talent for makeup. She was more than her profession. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a person with hopes and plans. Megan Waterman was the mother of a 3-year-old girl who was her world. Every penny she earned went to providing a better life for her child. She had a tattoo of her daughter's name right next to her heart. She dreamed of the day when she could leave escort work and find stable employment so she could be home with her daughter every night. Amber Lynn Costello was battling her demons, but she was also someone's friend, someone's relative. She had a kind heart and often helped other women in the industry. She was known for sharing her last money with someone who needed it more. She tried to improve her life, day by day. Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack, Karen Vergata, each had their own story, their own struggles, their own moments of joy and sorrow. They had families who loved them, friends who vermed them. They had favorite foods, favorite music, dreams for the future. They were not defined by their profession or the manner of their death. It is important that we remember them as complex human beings, not just victims. Their lives had value and meaning far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They deserve to be remembered with dignity and respect, not reduced to sensational headlines or morbid details. This case should serve as a reminder that every life has value, regardless of profession, socio-economic status, or life circumstances. Society has a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members, and when we fail in that responsibility, we must do all we can to bring justice. Thank you for spending time with me as we explore this complex and tragic case. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your bell for future cases. And please take a moment to remember the victims, their lives, not just their deaths. See you in the next video. Take care.